Hi, everybody. I'm going to give everybody about 20-30 more seconds to fill out that poll and get logged on. We have 27 attendees right now. It's a great turnout. We're expecting about double that. So people will probably log on as the morning ticks on. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there, and I'll share those results. So today we're here to talk about scenario planning and new budgeting around COVID-19. And it looks like 8% of you have not thought about doing scenario planning. 13% are too busy to respond because they're responding to the crisis. 33%, which is the biggest, have penciled it in on their current budget, but it's really not official. And then made changes right away and haven't spent much time with it since. That's about 21% of you. And then 25, you've made multiple scenarios and you revisit it every month with the board. So we've got kind of the whole gamut of scenario planning. So I think this will be a great class for us to do and give you guys some tools in order to do some scenario planning. So I'm going to launch in and we'll get this party started. So thank you for joining us for this free Zoom webinar for nonprofits, Something to Chew On. We hope you grabbed your lunch and you're ready to dive into the organization's COVID impacted financials as we explore budget and scenario planning. We will look at both day-to-day management budgets and strategic decision-making scenario plans with special consideration for COVID-19 impacts. We will also walk through a demonstration from the Nonprofit Finance Fund Scenario Planning Tool. Afterwards, we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A with our local financial whizzes, Lauren Ziesel and David Smiley. Can you guys give a wave? David Smiley has been a member of the Community Foundation's Finance Committee for just under 4 years. David is a certified financial planner, professional working with Oxford Financial Advisors in Durango. Dave specializes in retirement planning for individuals and families. Thank you so much, Lauren and Dave, for joining us today. Make sure your mics are open in between the two videos. So here is how you can ask a question. You can enter a question at any time in our chat box. We will monitor the questions and try to get everything covered, either in the chat box directly, or we will cover it live during the webinar. If we run out of time, there are a lot of questions, we will follow up via email. After the videos, you will have a chance to raise your hand and we will unmute you and you can ask your question live. All right, so now here tests my prowess. So just 1 second as I share the screen.
Welcome to the third webinar in our 4-part series, Managing in and Beyond COVID-19. My name is Brian Kellaway, and I'm an Associate Director with Nonprofit Finance Fund on our advisory services team. This webinar will be focused on best practices connected through the COVID-19 crisis. We appreciate that the work of nonprofits is critical now as ever, and we're striving to be as responsive to you and your needs as possible. We'll continue to offer our tailored lending services and strategic advice of our advisory services team as the current situation evolves over the coming months, continuing to lift up our learnings and insights to provide better understanding of the impact on the sector, specifically to nonprofits and to our philanthropic and government partners. Given the uncertainty facing the communities you serve, the individuals you employ, and your organization, developing budgets and scenario plans can feel more daunting than ever. Revenue uncertainty is not new in our world by any means, but perhaps this uncertainty has been amplified in recent months for your organization and may have limited your ability to reliably predict where future resources will be coming. Those expenses that have provided us with some level of predictability in our planning in the past may no longer feel like they're within our control. And certainly with the world changing around us so quickly, planning on next week or next month might seem like an impossible task. In acknowledging these realities, I want to remind you that so many organizations are facing the same challenges that may feel so isolating to you and your team currently in this moment. By no means is planning for your short and midterm needs an easy endeavor, but managing through these times with a clearly articulated plan and an understanding of the what ifs is critical to preserving mission. Communicating these plans with internal and external stakeholders will help to instill confidence in others and may also help to make nonprofit leaders like yourself feel less isolated. And looking to the future, I would encourage you to visualize and even reimagine the possibilities for mission delivery today and what it might look like on the other side of this crisis. So don't limit your thinking to your current strategic plan, and certainly do not limit it to what has worked in the past, since the return to normal operations is unlikely for most of us. Consider the aspect of mission that you deliver to your community that you want to preserve at the other side of this crisis, and really use that as a jumping off point for some of the creative reimagining of your work, focusing on the probable or perhaps the possible future conditions and events, how these conditions and events would impact your organization, and ultimately strategies for how you might respond to and benefit from these new realities. To support you in understanding and articulating these strategies, I'll be focusing on two tools that will help you to manage the day-to-day needs of your organization and support and inform critical decision-making. First tool is the budget. With budgets, I'll be covering approaches to budgeting in COVID-19 that include identifying business variables and also to support you in managing revenue uncertainty. Second tool is scenario planning. With scenario planning, I'll be covering approaches to articulating the what-ifs, possible contingencies or scenarios, and the triggers that would lead you to choose or to move in the direction of those contingencies. You'll notice that there are two other tools that are listed here that I will not be covering today, which is very much intentional. The second webinar in this series focuses on cash flow projections, which I would encourage you to view if you haven't done so already. The other is a multi-year budgeting projections, which will be important for longer-term planning as you're visualizing and reimagining your longer-term future. However, for the purposes of this series, we're really focusing on short and mid-term planning tools. It will be important for you to remember that the tools themselves will definitely not make the hard decisions for you, but hopefully they'll help to guide you through that decision-making based on the best available information you have in front of you today. Because the internal and external realities for your organization and the community you serve are evolving so quickly, we really don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good when planning for the future, focusing on the appropriate level of detail in these tools that will allow for simplicity, support you to be flexible, allow for change as new information will be presenting itself on a daily or weekly basis, will be important because ultimately iteration using these tools will be inevitable. Beginning with our budget is the financial management and monitoring tool that is most familiar to nonprofit leaders. As the needs of the community you serve are shifting and changing, your budget helps you to understand and communicate how you will be utilizing the limited resources that are available to your organization. It serves as a roadmap for a stated period of time, and it needs to be versatile, particularly in this COVID-19 environment. So a good budget will help you to certainly allocate resources, monitor your progress against your stated plans, increase your team's focus in the midst of so many different distractions you will be facing in the office, working remotely, and certainly with the personal lives and personal needs that folks are managing to, setting realistic goals for the short and midterm, implementing the decisions and strategies that come out of your budgeting and planning efforts, and communicating your priorities to internal and external stakeholders. And importantly, equally as importantly, beginning to really reimagine what the future might look like for your mission. I mentioned that the budget is likely the financial management tool that is most familiar to nonprofit leaders. However, your budget may feel more like an enemy than a friend in this moment. So let's explore some of the considerations related to COVID-19 that may impact your budget in new or different ways. Overall, you'll want to factor in the impact of physical distance on your ability to deliver services. You'll also want to consider how COVID-19 is impacting the community you serve and what that means for current and potential future need and demand for the services that you provide to the community. For many, these realities are dictating whether or not you are having to reduce, perhaps pause, or even eliminate some services, which will hopefully be limited to the short term, but certainly it may be an area of uncertainty for your team. With revenue, some of us may be experiencing losses based on having to reduce, pause, or even eliminate those services, or due to the fact that financial hardships may be presenting themselves and facing your funders and donors who have supported you historically. Others may be seeing an influx of new or amplified sources of revenue in the form of government stimulus support, or even perhaps emergency response funding from philanthropic partners, or perhaps some of your key donors. And there are many organizations that are communicating with their philanthropic partners around the impact of COVID-19 and hopefully having restrictions removed from current or future grant funding. On the expense side, you may be experiencing increases in near-term expenses due to COVID-19. Others may be seeing decreases in short-term expenses as you're having to reduce, pause, or eliminate the services. And you're likely starting to have to think about new expenses that you will need to be building into budgets moving forward as you're reimagining mission delivery and adjusting to what will be our new normal. These are just a few examples of what nonprofit leaders are experiencing and should be planning for, but it may be a useful exercise to engage relevant stakeholders in discussions about your unique situation as you're visualizing future plans and reimagining those possibilities for future missions. Once you have some sense of the short and midterm impact on your organization, you can then move to quantifying and articulating this impact with the numbers. Typically, I would encourage organizations to leverage historical financial data and past budgets for the purposes of establishing a baseline for planning. And while there may be valuable for taking a backwards look in some cases, it really is important to remember that there may not be a return to normal operations for a while or possibly even ever. I mentioned earlier that simplifying the planning process should be a goal as new information is becoming available on a daily or weekly basis. Your future planning needs to be responsive to this reality. So a line-by-line review of your budget is not a bad thing, but definitely focus on those big ticket items like personnel and occupancy costs on the expense side and your largest or most impacted revenue sources. As always, with future planning and budgeting, documenting assumptions is key to help remind yourself and others what led to the numbers that you're landing on. And feel free to start with your expenses before moving on to revenue, focusing both on the upfront and ongoing costs that may be new or could be changing. Ultimately, you'll want to be doing a little bit of back and forth between expenses and revenues, as the process, as I'm describing, is rarely a linear one. When articulating revenue and expense, consider your major business variables. I'll be providing a COVID-19 example coming up shortly, but variables at a high level are those factors that are causing revenue and expense to increase or decrease, things like staffing levels and service volumes. You'll also want to assess the reliability and probability of legacy and new revenue sources and estimate the number of gifts at varying levels if contributed revenue is an important part of your revenue. So I want to focus on business variables for a moment, using the lens of COVID-19 to walk us through a couple of examples. As I mentioned, business variables are those somewhat predictable factors that lead to changes in revenue and expenses. In this example, we're focusing on the impact that physical distancing might have on an organization based on the business variables of staffing or personnel and service volume. Starting with staffing, this organization and the physical distancing that's necessary in their community will require them to reduce on-site staff numbers, and they're doing so and have elected to move staff that are not frontline team members to working remotely. This also means that by doing so, the organization may need to provide these remote staff with equipment that will accommodate them working remotely. This could be laptops, perhaps tablets, or specific types of software that allow them to be effective in their remote environments. They're also eliminating their frontline volunteer workforce, which they will need to backfill with some new hires to supplement the frontline staff of the organization. And all those that will continue to be working on site will need access to personal protective equipment, PPE. The physical space in which the organization operates will also be cleaned more regularly and will actually require more enhanced cleaning procedures and protocols as a result of COVID. Looking to the variable of service volumes, physical distance will require this organization to respond to potential increase in the need and demand for services. However, the organization will need to limit the daily client volume to ensure that they're keeping the on-site number down to protect both clients and staff. Like staff, the clients will also need access to PPE, and the organization is also anticipating an increase in the need for ancillary services like transportation to get folks to site. In leveraging these variables to help us visualize the impact of physical distancing and how that will support us in taking action by predicting the changes to revenue and expenses, we want to come back to some of my advice earlier where I mentioned starting with the expense side. To support staff and working remotely, the organization here is estimating a cost of about $1,000 per remote staff to support those initial equipment investments and equipment needs for the purposes of them working remotely. To offset the loss of the volunteers, new hires will likely be brought in at about $18 an hour range. And these new staff hires and the existing frontline staff will need approximately $5 of PPE per day. They're also anticipating a 50% increase in the daily cleaning costs over their current budget, and the team anticipates a 25% reduction in daily client volume, which will also reduce programmatic costs. And just like staff, the clients that are on site will require that $5 worth of PPE per day as well. On the revenue side, making the accommodations for remote working due to physical distancing and the new hires to offset volunteers may make the PPP loan from the SBA a viable revenue option for this organization. They have applied and are awaiting a decision from the SBA, but they're also on the fence as to whether or not they will accept the loan if awarded. The reduction in service volume also means that they have anticipated a 25% reduction in their fee-for-service revenue. However, their ability to continue providing services at a reduced level might make them eligible for a $25,000 grant from a local foundation for some more emergency funding support. With these assumptions in mind and variables on hand, the leadership of this organization can now move to assessing the impact of COVID-19 and physical distancing on their current year budget. Beyond assessing the impact of the current year budget, it's also prudent to consider using short-term budgeting approaches that account for the changes on a shorter timeline. Here I'll offer an example of an approach that takes into consideration the next 3, 6, and 9 months. Utilizing short-term budgets will help provide greater visibility and flexibility for the management team. And budgets can be adjusted more easily as new information becomes available using these 3 different slices or 3 different timelines. And they'll also support your ability to communicate your reality with internal and external stakeholders. What we describe at NFF as telling your financial story. The importance of storytelling in times of crisis is critically important. I really can't understate this. When others are aware of what is happening and why, leadership's current assumptions and what changes can be expected in the short and mid-term will ultimately instill greater confidence in management and support buy-in, particularly from staff and board. So let's take a look at this approach to budgeting in practice. We are sticking with our example organization here, and we can see their fiscal year 2024 approved budget. I should note that their fiscal year is the calendar year of January 1 to December 31. We have all of their annual revenue, followed by their expenses, and their bottom line, or as you can see here, their surplus or deficit. And you should note that the numbers we are showing here are in thousands. Prior to the emergence of COVID-19, this organization projected $4.2 million in a combination of both earned and contributed revenue to cover $3.9 million in expenses for an operating surplus of $215,000. Their management team began the process of reviewing the board-approved budget at the end of March as the impact of COVID-19 was first being felt in the organization. During the first quarter of the year, their operations did not experience a tremendous impact, and the year-to-date deficit of $139,000 was tracking pretty closely to what they had anticipated given their business model and the nature of their service volume throughout the year. After having gone through the exercise of visualizing the impact of COVID-19 and physical distancing on their business variables of staffing and service volumes, they then utilized the 3, 6, and 9-month budgeting approach, which you can see here in green. All 3 versions of these forward-looking budget projections begin on April 1st, and the perceived reliability and accuracy of the budgets decreases each time they add 3 months to the model. We do see that they are hoping to maintain level of support for their annual gala, which is a fundraising event that is scheduled to take place in July. They have elected to move to a virtual platform, and while more than 30% of a reduction in revenues anticipated for the event, it is making an impact on reducing the overall deficit for the organization. Since the 3, 6, and 9-month budgets build on one another, leadership has been able to combine the year-to-date results through the end of March, that's the yellow column, and combine that with the 9-month budget projection in the last column in green to help them arrive at a reforecasted annual budget for fiscal year 2020 that takes into consideration the impact of COVID-19 and physical distancing. Our earlier exercise of visualizing and quantifying the impact of COVID-19 using the budget variables of staffing and service volumes can now be seen in the numbers of the budget forecast. Contract revenue has been reduced by 25% as a result of limitations on the number of clients that can be served daily in the facility. This does not represent a change in the contract with the county or the state, but rather a cap on the number of services that they can provide or the number of clients they can be served at any one time. Leadership is anticipating an increase in individual donations based on their strong relationships with their donor base and their ability to communicate their need outwardly. We can also see the reduction in revenue from the fundraising event overall based on July Gala having to move to a virtual platform. And the impact or lack thereof on the grants that they receive from foundation and government partners is illustrated here. They're able to continue receiving these funds regardless of the service volume reductions based on conversations with their partners that led to the removal of restrictions on their existing grants. The cumulative impact being a 10% decrease in total operating revenue. Moving on to expenses, there is an increase in personnel costs based on their ability to maintain their workforce and add new hires to offset the loss of volunteers. While there's no impact on their contract services, they do anticipate a slight cost savings on support and supplies due to a combination of increased PPE costs and then the overall reduction in programming. With occupancy costs, we can see the impact of the enhanced facility cleaning protocols and procedures. And finally, we see the decrease in volunteer expenses based on the elimination of the volunteer workforce. The cumulative impact on expenses being a 3% increase in total operating expenses. The impact on the bottom line is that the $215,000 surplus that was in their board-approved budget is now forecast to be a $338,000 deficit. What we are not seeing in the budget is the potential PPP loan from the SBA or the potential $25,000 in emergency funding from a local foundation, and this is intentional. When planning, I recommend that you do not assume that your organization is receiving government stimulus funding and encourage you not to make decisions about maintaining costs that you otherwise would not keep without those resources. Treat government stimulus and other response funding as a potential windfall and not something that you are expecting. I provided an earlier recommendation of starting with expenses before moving on to revenue. And there's a reason to that recommendation. Even in good or normal times for our organizations, budgeting is and can be with our revenue really uncertain and we can feel unpredictable. While focusing on business variables is helpful, it will not account for all the factors that contribute to whether or not you're able to secure certain sources of revenue. Things like relationships with funders, funder strategy, current initiatives, the economy, or the external market generally all impact the probability that we will receive revenue that we may be targeting into the year. One way you can manage this uncertainty is to predict the probability of revenue. The process begins by assigning a grade to each one of your expected revenue sources. I suggest using the letters A, B, C, D, and E to distinguish different levels of risk for each revenue source. For example, A here would be most dependable, while E would be highly speculative. For some, it will make sense to stop there, and I'll talk about why in a moment. For others, you want to move on to assigning each level of risk with a certain probability. It's completely at your discretion to make decisions about the appropriate probability range, but in this example, you'll see that we've assigned our A revenues with a probability greater than 90%, while those E revenues are tagged at a less than 25% probability. The important part is to apply these revenue grades or probabilities to each revenue source, indicating the likelihood of receiving that support. There are a few ways to go about this, and I'm going to share two common ways that you can use this probability information to support your own budgeting practices. The first approach is the cutoff methodology. I mentioned earlier that for some nonprofits, using the grades only without the probabilities may be the best approach and completely appropriate. If that is the case for you, you will then want to use the cutoff method. With the cutoff method, we take the sum of the full amount of all of the expected grant awards and include that in our budget, but only above a certain predetermined threshold. So for example, you may decide to set the threshold at C grade, and any C revenues and above would be included in your budget. Therefore, you would include the full amount of any revenue sources that are A, B, and C. You'll continue to track B and E revenues and work hard, hopefully, to convert them into A, B, or C revenues, but they're not going to show up in your budget. If you're assessing the probability of only a few sources of revenue, this may be the best approach for you. However, if you're assessing the probability of many different revenue sources and types that may be in your revenue pipeline, I might recommend the discount methodology. With the discount method, you are able to multiply the expected revenue amount by the probability percentage and then add up the discounted revenues from all sources to arrive at a total to be included in your budget. So for instance, on this slide, we have an example of a $20,000 grant that is 75% likely. So 20,000 multiplied by 75% is $15,000. And it's that $15,000 that would be included in your budget. For the $50,000 example, we've assigned a 25% probability to that, and therefore we would include $12,500 in the budget. This methodology is effective if you have a lot of different revenue sources for which you're assessing the probability. So again, thinking about the number of revenue sources and types will be important in deciding whether or not you're using the cutoff or the discount methodology. So let's take a look at these two methods in an example. You'll notice in the first column that we have a variety of revenue sources that we're considering for inclusion in the budget. This is followed by a total amount of funding that each one of these opportunities represents. Next, you'll see a grade that we've assigned as well as the probability. The next two columns are an illustration of both the cutoff and the discount methods. Beginning with the cutoff method, you'll see that we are using the threshold of C revenues and up. We are including the full opportunity amount for all A, B, and C revenue sources, and we are not including any revenue sources that are tagged as a D or E. With this approach, we arrive at $675,000 worth of revenue that will be included in our budget. In the last column, we have an illustration of the discount method. Here, we're reducing the revenue opportunity amount by the probability percentages that we've assigned to each source, and then including the discounting revenue amounts in our budget, which gives us a total of $650,000 in revenue utilizing the discount method. Do keep in mind that all revenue we are including in our budget should have a clear plan for how it will be secured. And I recommend avoiding budget plugs like to be raised, especially when we're budgeting in a crisis like COVID. We've walked through approaches to incorporating the realities of COVID-19 into our budgeting practices, creating 3, 6, and 9-month snapshots, and reforecasting the fiscal year 20 budget. And now we want to move into scenario planning exercise that will build on these budgets. Scenario planning gives us a chance to quantify the range of possible financial results given the various possible situations that could arise. You will want to start by identifying your driving questions, concerns, issues, risks, and opportunities facing your organization. You also need to know what actions you can take as a leader or manager that impact revenue and expense both positively and negatively, and the range of possible change. The outcomes of that change on your organization will be important to consider as well. Next, you will want to be sure to document all of your assumptions that are being made in any number of potential scenarios. If you're trying to understand the mission and financial impact of a potential scenario, sharing these assumptions will be critically important. With the current crisis, this might be the timeline for physical distancing and the impact that COVID-19 is having on the community that you serve. Finally, you will need to create an actionable plan with clear objectives for your organization. The plan should also include timelines, milestones, and benchmarks, as well as your contingency plans for when the what ifs happen or not, and the triggers that will cause you to move to these alternate scenarios or plans. I'm going to share an example of a scenario plan in a moment, but before doing so, it's important to acknowledge that there's no right or perfect way to engage in scenario planning. Since the goal here is to illustrate scenarios in a clear way with clear financial terms to gauge both your staff and board in discussion and decision making, the level of detail that you use is completely dependent upon your organizational needs. Some organizations will be fine with using a back of the envelope analysis. You're likely doing this all the time, and it absolutely has its place. This may be completely appropriate for lower stakes decisions or as a pre-step perhaps for a more formal planning process. What's important is that the thinking and understanding does not live in the head of just one person. You can also explore this from the perspective of a go, no-go scenario analysis, which can help you play out the implications of big decisions. You want to think through the ripple effects on revenue, expense, and the bottom line before making a decision for your organization. You can also use scenario planning to articulate a combination of better best or worse scenarios. You can think about this as a plan A versus a plan B. This is helpful when there are multiple elements in your budget that might change, and you perhaps will need to have a better grasp of the impacts of those changes. Finally, there's a detailed multi-year scenario planning approach that's similar to the best worst case budget scenarios, but takes your multi-year budget projections and considers major changes that could affect the plan, like a change in the funding environment or a policy decision that would affect your operations. This is likely a little bit more detailed than most organizations need when managing in COVID-19, but could be really helpful as you start to reimagine the future beyond the crisis. Combining these different approaches in your scenario planning is also appropriate. The example I will share will actually have elements of both the better, best, or worse scenarios, as well as the go, no-go scenario analysis. Just as I shared with budgeting, I want to offer suggestions on how you might apply specific thinking related to COVID-19 and the impact of physical distancing on your scenario planning efforts. Here we are attempting to support you in visualizing and really articulating the impact COVID-19 might have on the communities you serve, which is illustrated on the x-axis from mild to severe. We are also factoring in the timeline for physical distancing, which is demonstrated on the y-axis as short to longer term. If you decide to use a similar approach before jumping into developing your scenario plans, I'd encourage you to make this your own. You should also involve a small group of decision makers to help you think through the types of decisions you would make or actions you might take as you are talking through possibilities for the future. As you think through the types of decisions you would make or actions you might take as you're talking through those possibilities for the future, here you will see a simple example of a table to begin developing your scenarios. Again, there's no need to make this overly formal. Documenting assumptions in whatever way works for you is completely appropriate. To help orient you to the table, you will see in the first column that there are, with our exemplar organization, they've identified areas of the budget that they are testing the impact of two scenarios. On the revenue side, they're looking at earned and contributed revenue. On the expense side, they're looking at personnel, support and supply, and occupancy costs. The organization is then articulating assumptions to be tested against two scenarios, scenario A and scenario B. In scenario A, they are assuming that physical distancing ends or is significantly reduced by September 30th. This scenario also assumes that they will continue to see a significant need in the community and a growth in the demand for services. In scenario B, they are still assuming that physical distancing ends or is significantly reduced by September 30th, but in this case, they are assuming that they will only see a moderate change to demand for services. You can see how this is set up already as a better best or worst case scenario planning exercise. However, if you take a look at the last row of the table highlighting occupancy costs, they're also using this exercise as a go, no-go scenario analysis to support decision-making for their team on whether to rent additional space for programming, which would allow them to increase service volumes in the near term while physical distancing remains in place. You may remember that the constraints of physical distancing limited the volume of daily services, which has negatively impacted not only the mission of the organization, but their financial results as well. So starting with scenario A, assuming that physical distancing ends by September 30th, that service demand continues to increase, and that they are able to increase service volume by renting additional space in the community, here's what leadership is anticipating. They're expecting earned revenue from government contracts to increase. They also believe that they would be able to increase the July gala revenue if they can demonstrate to the community and to their supporters that there is a need and a growing need, and that they are responding by expanding their own footprint. That would mean an increase in personnel costs as well as support and supplies, and they would certainly see an increase in the occupancy expenses with the additional rental space. Moving on to scenario B, assuming that physical distancing ends by September 30th, but service demand does not increase substantially, even with the additional rental space, leadership is anticipating that earned revenue from government contracts would decrease. The July gala revenue would not change if they cannot demonstrate that the community is growing. They would likely still see that increase in personnel costs as they would continue to staff up for that additional space and certainly need to address the loss of the volunteer workforce, as well as the support and supplies. And they would still have to manage the increased occupancy expenses with the additional rental space. So once you've gone through this exercise and you're satisfied with your documented assumptions, using a budget-based scenario planning tool may help you map out how your revenue and expenses may respond to each one of these scenarios. It may also support you making decisions if you are exploring the going no-go scenario. Back to our sample organization, they are going to come back to that fiscal year 2020 forecasted budget, which they'll be using to serve as the baseline for analyzing the two scenarios that they visualized and articulated. Beginning with scenario A, we can see the impact of the realization of more contract revenue given the additional rental space for increased programming. There's the increased support from the annual gala based on their responsiveness to the community, and they are also using the scenario planning exercise to test the impact of that $25,000 in response funding for the foundation. You may remember that this was left out of the original budget as they were being appropriately conservative in that budget. They also included the increased staffing costs based on increased programming and reduced volunteer workforce, as well as the increased supply costs based on increased programming. And finally, the cost of the additional rental space, as well as the increased cleaning costs based on those enhanced cleaning protocols. In this scenario, we can see that based on the assumptions around physical distancing and COVID-19 impact on the community, the decision to add the additional space, that rental space, has actually reduced the operating deficit by $194,000. More importantly, they've reduced the deficit while increasing their mission impact. Moving on to scenario B, we can see the impact of the reduced contract revenue given those low to moderate increases in service volume. Here we do not have any change in support from the annual gala based on the baseline budget, but they are still testing the impact of that $25,000 in response funding from the foundation. They included the increased staffing cost as well as the increased supply cost, and finally the cost of the additional rental space and those increased cleaning costs as well. In this scenario, we can see that the decision to add the rental space has increased the operating deficit by $201,000 as a result of the limited demand from community members. It's clear that the decision to rent additional space in the community comes with some level of risk. For this organization, the financial risk must also be weighed against the mission imperative. To help them further explore these scenarios, the last component of the analysis, the potential impact of the PPP loan, which they estimate at about $500,000 if they were to receive the loan. Incorporating the stimulus funding into this scenario planning exercise will not only help them to make a decision about the additional rental space, but will also help them to consider whether or not the PPP loan is an appropriate option for this organization. So with scenario plans clearly articulated, both in numbers as well as our assumptions documented in words, your next step will be to focus on contingency plans. While the team you're working with to develop the revised budgets and the scenario plans is likely a smaller group of folks, this is the opportunity now to engage a wider group of key internal and external stakeholders in a conversation about the strategic decision or decisions facing your organization. Making a tough decision is never easy, but it'll be easier given the database insights that you have on hand that are grounded in the realistic assumptions that you made as well. Combining these with the input of the right people will put you in the best position to move forward with eyes wide open and make those decisions that are critical for the organization. Coming back to our example for a moment, whether the decision is to add the rental space or to stay the course with that reforecasted budget, whether it's to continue pursuing stimulus funding or not, you will need to develop specific contingency plans that prepare you to take appropriate future action to best protect the mission moving forward. Here is where we want to come back to that question of what aspects of the mission do you want to preserve at the other side of this crisis? Orienting around that question will help to inform your options for course correcting along the way, whether you might need to move to a scenario B or scenario C, or when you might need to revisit budgeting and scenario planning altogether. You also need to identify the triggers that will cause you to move in the direction of these identified contingencies. The last step is to operationalize your planning efforts in the form of an action plan. A good action plan will provide the roadmap for managing through uncertainty surrounding COVID-19 and will ensure you're bringing your people along with you. Be sure that the action plan captures timelines, benchmarks, implementation steps, and creates accountability, identifying the who, and includes a communication strategy for internal and external stakeholders. This is a key step to ensuring you're prepared to manage your organization as your scenarios begin to play out. With the contingencies and their triggers identified, developing a mechanism and a process for monitoring your progress in the short and mid-term will be key to ensuring that the signals to shift from your current operating plan and budget to an alternative scenario are easily identified by your team. You'll also want to articulate, for those that have not been involved in the process, the situation facing the organization, those mission imperatives and priorities that drove your decision-making, your assumptions and where you perceive there to be potential risks, as well as the triggers that you will have identified for moving to your contingencies. I want to reiterate that your budgeting and scenario planning tools are exactly that, they're tools, and they will not make the tough decisions for you. However, you will be able to make decisions much easier and faster, and address what are very tough decisions in a way that will ensure you're able to communicate clearly with your internal and external stakeholders, add to your vision for the near future, and how you're doing your best to protect what is most critical to mission moving forward. I hope that this information on managing in and beyond COVID-19 will help you in the coming weeks and months, and I certainly encourage you to explore the other webinars in this series if you have not done so already. And please continue to utilize the wealth of resources that Nonprofit Finance Fund has available to our nonprofit partners and the sector at large for managing in these challenging times.
Hi, everybody. Just checking in to see how you guys are all feeling. Looks like I might have had a question. I'm just gonna go look really quick. Nope, just comment on that one. I know that's a lot of information. And nff.org has a lot of great resources that are free. We encourage you to take a look. It is overwhelming, some of the resources out there, but I think what we'll do is we'll go into the next section, show you the tool that you can reference on NFF, and then we'll open it up for more questions. I think people are probably just percolating and trying to shake it off and understand what they just heard. So here we go. I'm just going to share my screen really quick.
Now more than ever, it's helpful to plan for different scenarios and gauge what needs to happen for you to maintain level services or take other. Building realistic scenarios, what if, helps management and leadership respond to unpredictable situations, giving organizations a chance to be thoughtful about big decisions that need to be made quickly and under pressure. We hope you will find this a useful tool in prompting your organization to consider up to 3 scenarios. We'll take the next few minutes to orient you to the tool so you can begin to apply it to your organization's needs. Some key items to keep in mind. This is a budget-based scenario plan, and it's organized like you'd expect for a budget. Revenues on top, then expenses, coming to a surplus or deficit at the bottom. NFF believes that unrestricted operating activities reflect an organization's true year-over-year financial performance. So, the tool is organized into 2 key sections. First, your operating budget. Those items that relate to the organization's main business or program activities. They may also be referred to as above-the-line activities, meaning they are included in the calculation of the operating surplus or deficit, the bottom line. Your operating budget includes operating revenue and expenses. Operating revenue is comprised of earned revenue, which is revenue or income received by an organization in exchange for its products or services. For example, program fees, tuition, or performance-based government contracts. Contributed revenue. Contributed revenue is revenue or income received from individual, foundation, corporate, or government donations without restrictions, as well as net assets released from restrictions for operations. And finally, operating expenses, the regular costs of doing business, which includes your staff, consultants, occupancy, and all other expenses. All other expenses include program-related and other costs not captured in the categories named above. Your operating revenue less your operating expenses results in an operating surplus or deficit before depreciation expense. The next section includes your non-operating revenue and expenses. That is, those items not directly related to the organization's program or other main activities. They can include capital campaign grants, expenses related to capital projects, gains or losses in the investment portfolio, and one-time or extraordinary transactions such as the sale or write-off of assets. This section may also be used to account for dollars passed through an organization. For example, re-grant funds. Your non-operating revenue less your non-operating expenses results in your net non-operating surplus or deficit before depreciation expense. Row 85 calculates your organization's total surplus or deficit, operating plus non-operating. Let's populate the tool. We're looking at your approved budget for a single year matched with 3 potential cases. In this example, we have a base case, best case, and a worst case scenario. Notice that each case has a corresponding column to capture your assumptions and identify the financial drivers that result in change within each scenario. Begin in column A to enter budget line items. Broad categories have been suggested, and we encourage organizations to make use of them. However, additional spaces are provided to customize the spreadsheet to your organization's unique requirements. You may also insert rows for additional line items. And don't forget to adjust any necessary formulas if you add rows. Next, In column C, enter your organization's approved budget for each of the detailed line items for the current year, using rounded numbers to the nearest dollar. For this demonstration, I will enter information in thousands of dollars. In column D, enter your year-to-date actuals, the latest month data you have. Column E will become your base case or most likely financial picture. That is, given where you are on a year-to-date basis, estimate or reforecast your budget based on how you think you will now end this year, given most recent information. Make note of your assumptions in column F, capturing the detail behind this scenario. For example, if our season is cut and we only receive 50% of earned revenue. Next, comparing the base case you just created in column E, continue the analysis line by line, making your best educated guess on how revenue and expenses will change, carefully thinking through the relationship between changes to revenue and expenses to create scenario A, your best case, and scenario B, a worst case. Again, make note of your assumptions, capturing the detail behind these scenarios. Once you complete your input, you can begin to assess the scenarios. Compare your base case with each of your scenarios. Articulate the headlines, major trends, and insights. Note important events, decision points, or risk. Column O provides you space to identify where leadership should dedicate and prioritize resources. Remember, scenarios are dynamic, which is why the tool prompts organizations to consider a number of scenarios. Typically, organizations like talking about best, base, and worst case, but we encourage you to put as much detail behind scenarios as you can. It's also really important to consider your balance sheet when you're thinking through the action plan. What cash, reserves, etc. you have at any given point. This informs your action plan because it tells you what your financial flexibility or options are and how urgent the situation is, your runway for taking action. Ultimately, the tool should provide a clear picture of the risk factors and the response levers, giving you a data-driven view of what to prepare for and what to talk about. The assumptions allow management and leadership to inform the programmatic and financial narrative rather than relying on gut feelings. This is a great example of using numbers to tell a story about what might happen. For more on communicating with boards, staff, constituents, and funders about the current situation and what is needed to fully respond to this crisis, visit our COVID-19 resource page for NFF's guide to narrating your financial situation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So that tool is available on nff.org. You can use it to do your scenario planning. Just to give you an example, for the Community Foundation, we were not able to do Making a Difference and not able to do the Durango Wine Experience. So we have changed our budget and we have taken into consideration and done that scenario planning with those two events not there. On the other side of the coin, we have more individual donations to SURF than we obviously had budgeted because we didn't know this was coming down the pipe. And so we've got to add that in. And so those are the kinds of things that each of you can think about your budgets and decide how that works. So I'm looking here, we have, you can do questions on Q&A on the chat box. Or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. You can ask live. So it looks like I've got something here. When it comes to looking at expected revenues, whoops, it just disappeared. 1 second. When it comes to looking at expected revenues, are there specific instances when using the ranking method versus the discount method may be preferred, or does it really depend on the organization? Lauren and Dave, if you want to take a look at that. Oh. You're muted, Dave. Let's see if we can figure that one
Sorry
out.
about that. Sorry. I think the second method, my looking at that is more aggressive. I like the first method because if you, in the example, I don't know, I just think that the percentage of probability, you're either going to get probably all the money or most, or, you know, so in my opinion, you would want to be conservative. That would be me though, being an advisor.
Lauren, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the organization and where the funds are coming from as well. You know, with all the uncertainty that we are facing today, and it seems like there's something new that changes every single time we turn around. I agree with Dave in that if we can look at the more conservative approach, that's probably best and end up, you know, potentially better on the other end.
Yeah. So to all of you people, attendees, if you ask a question, your name goes in our hat. So later at the end of the session, we will be drawing from a door prize for 2 hours of time with David Smiley. And so you can ask questions or get information. And so every time somebody asks a question, your name goes in the hat a second time. So I'm just monitoring chats and those kinds of things. I have a question. Would you guys consider loans as an acceptable part of scenario planning?
I will take that one.
Banker?
The banker, yeah, absolutely. You know, loans for nonprofits can be a good option for scenario planning. However, you have to be very, very careful. As a lender, when we speak with our nonprofits, there has to be a very good defined plan on how this loan will be repaid. We don't want to just put a Band-Aid on a problem and let it snowball into something that could be worse and make cash flow problems potentially worse. And so it's a really planned out, potentially good solution if there's a plan on how it gets repaid for the nonprofit.
Yeah. Dave, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think that's really good, Lauren. I would agree with that because you don't want to just keep getting into a hole if you don't have contingency funds, emergency funds, or investment funds to tap. I think I'd be very careful with the loans.
So I have a follow-up to that. Would you consider a low interest loan before dipping into investments? And why or why not?
As an advisor, I guess I look at it similarly to if you have to pay off your mortgage versus investing that money. So you sort of have to look at what you're invested in and how much money that is versus how much the interest payment is on your loan. So if your interest payment on your loan, we'll just say is 5%, it's probably not going to be that high in this day and age, but say it is, and if you can't earn that same amount in your investment accounts, then that's probably not a good idea because, does that make sense?
Yeah. Lauren, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, you know, so what Dave is saying is, you know, if your investment account is earning less than that 5%, then from a cash flow and budget standpoint, you're negative, and that impacts your cash flow and your income going forward. So you do have to look at the return on your investment account against what you'd be paying in interest on a loan to see what would be the benefit of the organization, whether to use that. And it could be a mix of two. It could be, you know, we have this cash, but we like having reserves with this scenario planning, you know, for just in case. And so maybe there's a happy balance there between the loan and using, you know, all of the organization's cash potentially.
Right. I know a lot of people are looking at fourth quarter, and maybe haven't done the scenario planning yet and are looking at fourth quarter, realizing they really need to. So they need to understand how much they have to raise year end, whether it's through an online event or year end ask. How do you bring your board in as you're updating your budget? How do you communicate in a way that board members will understand? Do you have any recommendations on the scenario planning and communicating that to your board?
I think that you can bring the separate scenarios to the board, but I'd say simplify them because they don't want to know the details and the line items that are in your scenario planning, and bring them to your board with all of the information of each scenario. And I would also recommend opening it up to the board to see if they have any other ideas or suggestions for additional funds or for cutting expenses or what have you. But that's how I would present it. I mean, even a best zero scenario and worst case scenario and all of those, so that they have all the information and can make the right decisions for the organization.
Right. I know Erin, our finance director, and Tracy and I, we did for 2021, we did best case scenario, middle of the road, and then worst case. And that worst case hurts your heart. But you just have to do it. You have to understand what the options are out there so that you don't go in without understanding the ramifications of what COVID could continue into 2021.
Yeah.
So
the worst thing you could do is surprise your board.
That's true. Yeah, I say that about parenting all the time. Just don't surprise me. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm going to give everybody a minute to raise your hand or post a question if you guys have any other questions. Before we go into the door prize section, I just think, maybe you guys just need a minute to think. I do want to just let everybody know that we will be continuing these Something to Chew On webinars twice a month and through the end of the year. And so I just was going to give you a sneak peek of what's coming up. So we have in October, Denise Clark will be doing our October, and she is doing a session October 6th from 12 to 1:30 on reinventing fundraising during COVID-19, replacing handshakes with thumbs up emojis. And I don't know, some of you on the call may have seen her work at the Telluride Foundation. She's very thorough. She has great ideas, really a great webinar. And then on October 20th, she is doing Managing People in Pajamas, How to Successfully Build a Remote Workplace Culture. And I think a lot of us are still dealing with that and know that we may go back to that in the fall/winter. So I think both of those will be great. And then in November, we have Southwest Colorado Gives and year-end ask. And then in November 17th, we have Don't Be a Zoom Zombie, Learn Bells and Whistles to Host Engaging Interactive Virtual Meetings and Retreats. As a lot of us think forward on our retreats, we're gonna need to figure out how to make Zoom fun, interactive, interesting. And Sandia has some great ideas. And a lot of you know Sandia Tillotson, and we're so excited to welcome her in that webinar. So I'm just glancing at all of my different question tools, and I'm not seeing anybody asking questions. So
We have one in the Q&A.
oh, we do? Oh, here comes one. Let's see. I know it depends on the needs and the cash flow of each organization, but is there a best practice when scenario planning should take place in relation to budgeting?
We talked a little bit about this in the cash flow section a few weeks ago. And if you didn't have the chance to participate, I believe that video has been recorded and put on the website as well. Right now, when it comes to cash flow and scenario planning, and I think there's another question out there as well about how often we should be doing this, because again, things are changing so quickly. I would say that, well, scenario planning should be done now, so that you can understand what the rest of the year looks like and what your organization looks like into next year. When we look at cash flow planning and understanding and making sure that you have enough reserves to weather the ups and downs of the normal day-to-day operations, I recommended that cash flows be reviewed at least monthly. And there's also a tool that you can look at weekly cash flows too for your organization if it fluctuates that month. You should be looking at your budgets on a monthly basis. I think you should do the strategic planning now and be open for flexibility and change, because that happens. You should be looking at your cash flows at least monthly, if not weekly.
Thank you, Lauren. Dave, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I would just say COVID isn't going to go away like people maybe thought earlier in the year. I personally think that, this is just me speaking, but we know as people go indoors that things are probably with the flu season coming on. So whether any of that plays into your organization concerns or, scenario planning, think of it that way. We don't know when this is going to end. It's probably going to be through the middle of next year, perhaps longer. Just because we have a vaccine, we will not necessarily be out of the woods. That'll take 6 to 10 months before that actually does anything. They keep taunting we're going to have this vaccine. Well, that's not going to change things for a while.
Yeah, it's a good thing to keep in mind. And we're thinking about that too as we try and think about events next year and which are major fundraisers for nonprofits. So I couldn't agree more. And it's a scary concept. If we don't have events through a majority of 2021, which I think is where a lot of people's comfort level is, 6 to 10 months after the vaccine. So we're going to draw the door prize in just 1 minute. Tracy's going to bring over the bowl so I can reach in. And in the chat. Oh, it looks like there's from Joy Thompson. What exactly goes into determining a discount percentage for the discount methodology?
Wasn't that based on the probability
Yes.
of the revenue stream?
Right. So for instance, if you have $10,000 in for your grants, and you think you might get 1 or 2 of the several that you could discount that based on the probability of you receiving the 3 grants that you submitted. What are some other examples? Maybe if you're pivoting from a regular event to an online event, you may in your head think, I'm only going to raise half of what is budgeted because it's a pivot event and we just don't think that the online event is going to raise as much.
Or to that example, introducing new events. We've seen a lot of new ideas and events coming online, and there are a lot of great expectations, but you have to be so careful, especially when it's brand new and there's not a lot of people familiar with what you're trying to do and how it works. Fortunately, we have seen some success with our local organizations on that online forum, but you just never know. Right.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a poll up here. I'm going to close it in 5 seconds. So if you're contemplating your answer, you can whiz it right in there. 3, 2, 1. So the poll looks like this. I think so it looks like, how have your fundraising and events been impacted in 2020? 35% of you say events were canceled. Unsolicited individual donations have made up the difference. That is amazing. The next highest is 24% that we pivoted and had alternative fundraisers that raised less than half. So there's that, Lauren, to your point, sometimes those don't. At 12% that they pivoted and alternative fundraisers raised more than half, which is great. We canceled our events and have been unable to execute a viable alternative at 29%. That's kind of scary as you approach fourth quarter. And then we are planning for a robust year-end campaign to make up for the COVID shortfall, and that's 24%. So next month's webinar should be really good in the sense of, you know, covering off on those topics. So now I have all of the names of everybody who was participating. And so if you'll raise your hand if this is your name. Brenna Anderson, and we will connect you with David Smiley. If Brenna is still on, I see her name, so I see her hand is raised. So congratulations, Brenna. Thank you guys so much. I know this is hard work. It's hard thinking. It is so valuable, and I really appreciate everybody who logged on. There was, at one point, almost 30 people on. Appreciate you guys thinking about the hard work and making it happen, especially as we approach fourth quarter. The finance being in September wasn't accidental. We know that this last quarter is going to be very challenging, and we wanted to offer you some tools so that you could do this as successfully as possible. So thank you so much for being here. We are done for the day, and we will see you in October. Have a great week, you guys.